Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Wednesday lecture at Divinity School. I'm Karen Wine, I'm the Director of Communications here and organizer of this series, so it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Before we start, I want to do our usual housekeeping. I want to thank the crew and today's chef Blair for this meal. If you're looking for creamer for coffee, it's up here. You have it. And I think different tables have some different ice creams, so you can vote from someone. And there is a vegan option going around. I don't know where it ended up, but it's still back. So there is a vegan option. We do ask that you clean up after yourselves on your way out. You can put your trash in the thing marked trash, and your compost in the thing marked compost. That's helpful. Put your silverware in the soapy bags. Turn off your cell phone. Are there any community announcements today?
Well, the fun never stops at the Crash Teaching Program. And this Friday, we have a very special event that I hope all of you can come to, at least in part. It's an all-day colloquium on introducing religion. 7 members of the Divinity School faculty, including Professor Elsner and Professor Elsner and Dean Mitchell, will all be selecting an object or a text and using it to illustrate some of the representative challenges and opportunities of introducing religion to people who have not yet studied it in an academic context. Something that I imagine many of us will be called upon to do in the classroom, in the public sphere, wherever we find ourselves. There is a schedule online. There's a schedule also posted somewhere around. You should feel free to come to one session if it interests you. You can come for the whole day. Breakfast and lunch will be provided for everyone who's there. It really does promise to be very special. I hope you can make it. That's here in the common room on Friday, 9 to 5. And then on Monday, we have the first of our 3 Arts of Teaching sessions this quarter. This one with Reverend Joe Glosser leading a session on the pedagogy of service learning, which I imagine will be of some interest to many of you. So, hope to see you there.
Anyone else? No? Okay. I'm going to actually turn over the introductions now to Dean Mitchell, who will introduce our speaker. So I'll see you.
Thank you, Karen. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Yash Elsner, our speaker this afternoon. Yash Elsner is Humphrey Payne Senior Research Fellow at Corpus Christi College at the University of Oxford, and he holds concurrent appointment as visiting professor of art and religion in the Divinity School for this and the following 2 academic years, and as well as an affiliated status in the Department of Art History and the Division of Humanities here at the university. Professor Elsner is a world authority on late antique art, Roman, Christian, Jewish, etc., but also has written extensively on the range of art down into the modern period. Among his books, the one that you should definitely splurge and buy is entitled Art and the Roman Viewer, which is already a classic and is a much heralded work in the field. He also co-edited, together with our colleague Francois Meltzer, a series of papers on saints, which was also the subject of a course. And most recently, just arrived on my desk, is an edited collection, Art and Rhetoric in Roman Culture, edited by Professor Elsner and Michael Meyer. And I'm going to pass that around, but it better get back to me. Professor Elsner is the principal investigator of a major project entitled Empires of Faith, which is a joint project of the British Museum and the University of Oxford. And one of the real advantages for us is that Chicago will not only have a front row seat to this project, but in fact will be active participants, most principally at an international conference that will be held here at the Divinity School and within the full university, sponsored by the Marty Center and the Franke Institute on October 2nd to 3rd. So this Wednesday lunch is a nice opportunity for you to have the priming of the pump on this major research project that is underway. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Elsner.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for coming to this lunch. What a wonderful occasion. I was, in fact, Francoise and I did a double act, more of a comedy double act, I hope. Anyway, for the Saints book in this very occasion. I'm going to wander around with this so that I can actually see what I'm showing you. Now, the Empires of Faith project is a very peculiar, as all these things are, the result of peculiar circumstances. The British Museum was offered a lot of money by the Lever Trust, which is the Lever brothers are the Procter and Gamble of the other side of the water, and so they have a lot of money, and that money was left to a trust. So, and they're very significant funders of both humanities and sciences in the UK, and they gave a large sum to the British Museum, which thought long and hard about what it wanted to do, what kind of project it could do that would bring the different parts of the museum. And I don't know how much people here know the British Museum, but it goes from very early, and it's changed the names of its departments, but one of them used to be called Medieval and Later. If you operate in an art history department as I do, and it was kind of 19th century and earlier, contemporary, you can see the difference. So what the museum decided is that the thing that stood in the centre of all its range of interests, was late antiquity. That is to say, looking across Eurasia and Europe and Africa and so on, the late antique period between, as it were, its very ancient collections and its more contemporary collections. For example, it is the main collection of prints and drawings in the UK. Late antiquity sat in the middle, and therefore it was a way of uniting, kind of trying to bring the museum together. And this is a hugely complicated thing because a museum is made up of departments whose main interest in life is not to talk to each other. And so, to try to, and now you see my problem in life, I am the person who tries to make them talk. And to bring objects and to bring people between these departments together to make a conversation. And when they asked me to get involved, I said that I wasn't going to leave Oxford or move from where I live, and that the project would have to come to Oxford, in part. And that was an interesting venture because one of the big problems, I think it is probably true in this country, but but it's certainly true in Europe, is an increasing divide between the museum culture and the university culture. And obviously with objects and the study of works of art, that actually is not healthy. There are all kinds of good administrative, financial, bureaucratic, and all those kinds of reasons, but those aren't good academic or intellectual reasons. And so this is in part a venture that's attempting to break a bit of that mould. The great advantage of bringing the project to Oxford was that if it had been in the museum, you could just see the reflex from all the powers that be that would get the people we hired to classify and put index cards on yet another few objects. And of course that's a great thing, very useful to any museum, and the British Museum has untold piles of boxes they never unpacked, but useless if you actually want to make some kind of academic project. We have 5 years of project, but the first year was spent hiring people. So it's 4 years of work, which looks like a lot from one side, and from another side, especially my side being right in the middle of it, is not very much. Because each of the people we hire, we have 6 postdocs, 3 doctoral students, a curator within the museum, and then a number of curators who come and go for shorter periods, plus various others who may just come for a short time to advise us or whatever. I have to make sure that those people do the projects they're doing and do the collective things we do together. And those collective things, it being the British Museum, which is a very strange institution, were completely unclear for a very long time. Suddenly they've become an exhibition that we're doing in Ashmolean in 2018. and there are a number of small books and so on. So suddenly there's a lot. And all that has to, my job basically, I mean, I'm called principal investigator. I don't know what that means really. As far as I can see, that means herding cats. And I'm just a poor humanities academic. And what I'm doing is running a lab. I mean, in other words, it's a change into a different kind of academic discourse, or a different kind of academic operation, which is extremely interesting. And most of it is actually about managing human beings. And the varieties of complications and problems people have with each other, with their lives, and particularly we have people from all over the world, Russians, Tunisian French, and so on and so forth. They have to be brought and settled in a place to be able to work. And well, so that's actually the job. I shouldn't really be talking about the project really. Anyway, so to move from that pragmatics to the project as it stands. So what we have is a remit to look at the iconographic, the generation of the world religions, which is broadly speaking from 200 to 800. That's our rough timescale in terms of the creation of visual iconographies and art. And so the span of that is, as it were, from Britain and Spain, North Africa on one side, right across to India. This bit of India, now we could have gone further. We could have gone into China and even Japan, but at that point I thought we'd be out of control. And there is a problem. It's easier to find people working on the western side. There are many fewer people working on as you go east, and that's a fundamental difficulty. And one of the things that we were hoping this project would, in some sense, begin to allay. So, what we didn't know what we were going to do until we hired the people, because in the end, the specific expertise of the individuals concerned modulates how you run it. But what we have is people in Western Christianity, Eastern Christianity, Umayyad Islam, the religions of the Roman Empire before Christianity, in Sasanian, and in Kushan, which means the beginnings of both Hindu and Buddhist iconography. In fact, also Jains, but there's a limit to how much we could cover in time. And we have two outputs that we promised the project, apart from people's individual books or doctoral theses. One of these, a collective methodological book about the problem of how you write religion out of images. It's actually a big problem. It's not that obvious. And also of the ways in which images could be evidence for religion, which is a version of the same problem, but not quite. And that is the project that that section is what we'll bring to Chicago 2nd and 3rd of October, where we'll have presentations from pretty well all members of the project in the different areas, and I hope lively interrogation from the scary members of the faculty here. So that, if you like, is the geographical scope. Now, I've just put up a few slides that give a sketch of how we've been, some of our thinking. So the first problem is the British Museum dated itself 200 to 800, and that's rubbish. That can't work. It's not. It's fine. It's a number of dates, and you have to manage. You have to manage it. But actually, Alexander can be the only realistic way of thinking. Some kind of rapprochement, some kind of, the conquest isn't quite rapprochement, but some kind of interconnection between East and West that is different from the variety of interconnections that there have been before. And one of the things that's interesting is, as I've said here, Alexander takes, well, let's call it culture. It's probably a Eurocentric way of putting it, but nevertheless, certain things come through Alexander that remain in the East. For example, the style of Greek art, certain forms of the style of Greek art that we find in Gandhara, Greek script and epigraphy. So, for example, Ashoka, when he does his famous edicts, chooses to use Greek as well as the other languages. the Indian languages. That's a gesture of some kind. And certain forms of civic life. So we have these Bactrian urban kingdoms, which have some forms of Greek civic life. It's very easy to overestimate this. One of the problems of the history of the literature is, of course, it has massively overestimated this. And then there was a massive reaction, so you couldn't talk about any kind of interconnection. And I think this is the first moment for maybe 50 years in which you can not worry about the bug of Orientalism as much as one had, and try to think about interconnections within a kind of global space. And the new space of a kind of globalization in the culture, I think, has enabled some of the questions of this project to be asked in a way now that couldn't have been asked 20, 30 years ago. But Alexander, where he took something, he also brought something back. That is relatively less acknowledged by my classical brethren. But the notion of empire, of the kind of empire that is focalized around religion in some way, the Hellenistic, which became the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Roman Empire, in a certain sense comes out of Iran. Now, but what he doesn't say is, bring, as I've said, is a state religious system. And in some sense, the problem of how you marry imperial control with the closeness of identity that a state religion can provide, you might argue is one of the ways we can see the development in a long durée of Roman and Parthian kingships. And all of this is before our project starts. It's irrelevant to the project, but it has to be its fundamental underpinning. Oops, wrong way. Now, one of the interesting things is the question of toleration. And the Roman Empire is famously tolerant, whatever that means. Unless people resist the empire through their religious practice, it doesn't seem to worry about them. It is not tolerant of the Jews when they rise up against the Roman Empire, and it is not tolerant of the Christians when they refuse to do what, from the Roman point of view, was a very reasonable request. From the Christian point of view, it was definitively and constitutively unreasonable. But this is a disagreement. And I'm not going there. Anyway. But one of the interesting things is that that kind of tolerant model of allowing many religions to flourish within a world that is dominated by one or another is certainly true of the Arab conquerors throughout early Islam. And I think it's important, because one doesn't think it, but it's important to think that how large the non-Muslim populations are, right, certainly until 1000, in the worlds that the Arabs conquer. So what we have is not just state religions, but religions that are functioning within other hegemonies, and there's a complex and mix. Now, in a new book, very important book by Garth Fowden, I don't know if anyone's seen this, Before and After Muhammad, which is in fact a prequel to his very big book, which is called something like The First Millennium, which is in the middle of writing. He wants to argue for late antiquity to be realistically understood as between 0 and 1000. And his claim about 0, which is a very worrying date, is that it's Augustus, which is a very elegant figure. But that obviously I don't like 0 because it is too Christianocentric. And the two attacks one might have on Fowden. Fowden's a very interesting book because he's a Byzantinist who's really taking an analysis of the thrust of late antiquity into early Islam. And he has to be right. He has to be right. The Eurocentric resistance to the East is useless. It doesn't help. However, his understanding of Islam is Eurocentric, would be archaic. It's too looking towards Byzantium. And it is very interesting that when the Muslim armies began, the first thing they did was attack the East. They went to Kushan and they lost. They didn't lose when they went west. And one of the issues, all the arguments about iconism in Islamic art and so on, they often focused on resistance to Christian imagery and so on. but actually it is as much, at least, about resistance to early Buddhist imagery on the other side. Islam is in dialogue. And so one of the things, the way we're thinking of progressing is rather than looking at empires, it's the spaces of empire, which I'm afraid my map, if I'd had my map doesn't help you very much, but it labels them. So instead of thinking of the spaces of empire, which is how Fowden thinks with this geography, and indeed he's not unique, I mean most people think that way, we want to think in terms of borderlands, thinking this space, this is the crucial space in which, round here, that is to say, Asia Minor and the Levant into Egypt, it's the crucial space in which, in the space of dialogue, or conflict, or syncretism between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Parthian world, and later the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Islamic world, it's in that space that many of the religious changes originally arise. So, the argument is that now the second set of borderlands is between the Sasanian world and Kushan. That is, and again, the first Buddhist art arises precisely there, and much of the first Hindu art arises there. There is a dialogue on that side of the story, and then there's a further borderland which might be said to be where the various invaders come on the western side, the Vikings and so forth, in relation to what's by then an established Christianity. So, if I return to my... So, we've identified three kind of rough borderlands in a conceptual way, really, to think about places where new religions are generated and new religious iconographies come in their wake. Those borderlands are in part conceptual because, for example, much early Christian art then develops in Rome. But nevertheless, in many ways, not least its scriptural, scriptural reference or the image of the Magi with Phrygian hats and so on, it refers back to an Eastern origin of some kind. Now, one of the obviously the central pieces of this argument is art historical. The other one is about religion, and this becomes very complicated. The difference between prophetic religions, scriptural, exegetic, and that all has to be married into a big argument. So you can see the complex of the project. The initial section, though, is less on this slide than on trying to look at the incommensurability of the religious iconography, of the literatures, the discussions of the religious iconographies of these various religions as we have them already. That is to say, the current scholarship is simply, first of all, it's not globalized in terms of its approach, and secondly, it's utterly resistant to, basically it's making ancestral claims for the party that the scholars are writing for. And that needs to be unpacked, and then we need to think about how we might start again with a more global picture. So that's our first project. And I thought, well, so here we have a little note about art, and one of the arguments we want to make is that there's a kind of dialogue, a structural differentiation between the different religions and their iconographies. So there's only one that chooses images as part of its scriptural frame. That's Manichaeism. It lost, but it had a glorious moment. And indeed, it might have been happenstance that stopped it, rather than any particular failure. But we have iconographies that come to being through differentiation, and I think the classic one is Islam, which seems to me to be very much in dialogue with the established religions around it. Of course, it is the baby on the block, the newest of the great religions that as they arise in late antiquity, and it's a very interesting process of formulating something which is both extremely dependent on all the other models and actually finds a way of being distinctively different. So now, just some examples. So here people talk about Islamic aniconism, and here's a case on the left. It's a wonderful painted stucco from Nishapur, so just at the end of our project's scope, but the beginning of the Abbasid era. And on the right, a famous page from the Book of Kells, same period. And one of the claims would be that alongside the iconic and the focus on the figural, which obviously has been the main thrust of discussion in our historical discussion about the iconographies of the religions except for Islam, actually that process can be seen in the others too. And there are different kinds of choices. Different kinds of choices are made, and there's something interesting, something tantalising about a comparison of this kind. Clearly, there's no sense of influence, and one isn't influencing the other. But both do draw, ultimately, on paradigms and patterns borrowed from the dialogue of the bigger Roman world with cultures around it. Then we have questions of saviour deities and how they might be represented. What sorts of issues? So here we have Mithras killing the bull on the left in a highly cosmological pattern, and on the right we have the saviour being sacrificed, a kind of reversal or a structural differentiation of a different kind, in religions which are clearly in some sense related, in that they lived together in the same culture and developed their iconographies at broadly the same time. Here we have, sorry, it hasn't come out brilliantly. It's a relatively rare Manichaean object on the left, but you can see that in some sense the Manichaean iconography draws off on the kind of Sasanian iconography, I should have put a Sasanian coin there, that is also then drawn on by early Islam in its first coinage before it went unrecorded. And this is a very, it's a rare coin, but on the right you have the lance of the prophet, so you have a kind of a rival to the Byzantine use of the cross on the back of its coins. And this is a very interesting coin to demonstrate that point that forgetting the Sasanian, you can't forget the Sasanians when you think of Islam. Islamic iconography is very deeply dependent and self-differentiating ultimately from the Sasanians. And then my final comparison, and again you see, of course Vajrapani is a kind of Heracles. On the left Vajrapani, on the right Heracles, and yet these things are very different in their context. So those kinds of iconographic movements and how we might make sense of what is ultimately an extraordinarily generative moment in the visual and religious cultures that have come to define a very large part of the global experience today. So any questions or whatever?
Are you going to think of how things, especially in the Roman Empire, outside the Roman Empire, traveled all over the place, and then suddenly you see things like this.
Yeah.
And of course, they also brought things back.
Yeah. I mean, it's essential, and one of the there has of course been some study of this, although it's much more in the arena of trade, those sorts of questions. But that question, of course, the difficulty is that for many, many years it was politically incorrect to play the story of travel and influence. It's obviously blindingly obvious that there's something going on. And so it's to find ways of discussing these issues in a grown-up way, because the normal stories of a Eurocentric narrative, an easy Eurocentric narrative, the Greeks brought culture to the far east, whatever, and that is clearly an incorrect. It's a ridiculous story. But how we find a way of making that dialogue work? We have plenty. Apollonius of Tyana. We have plenty of texts about bringing the wisdom of India including, we take it, Yakas, probably Arahat, I mean, probably in Apollonius, probably we're thinking Buddhism, although it's not named as such. So there is certainly a notion there of bringing religion from the East. And yes. Yes.
That one very late, where the confusion between Buddhism, especially if you went into Tibet or someplace, and Christianity was, oh, well, they've got monasteries just like us, they've got this, they've got that, but they're not the same.
Yes. Yes, that's gone right.
Follow up on that just a little bit. You mentioned globalization, kind of modern globalization has enabled us to ask new questions. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about where you think sort of our current global context has enabled you to ask, what's the other sorts of questions as
well, from the point of view of the British Museum, it's very straightforward, actually. The museum is in a financially difficult situation. It can only think about exhibitions that bring in large numbers. That generally means, sorry for saying, sex. Roman, Japanese, you name it. But and really, I mean, go back on the website, you will see that is what their exhibitions have been. And whereas in America, religion would work, not in Britain. So that's a complication. However, at the same time, there's a public mission to deal with local communities. And they had a Hajj exhibition, and the Hajj exhibition was not a success from the point of view of numbers, but it was an extraordinary success in bringing into the museum, which they didn't imagine, actually. They thought it was going to be for the usual public to come and find out about the alphabet. But actually, the people who came were Muslims, in very large numbers. And so there's a kind of mission element there, which is rediscovered in a less colonial, let's say, not non-colonial way, the globalised multiplicity that is present in a big city like London, or would be so in similar ways, Mutatis in Chicago. And so I think that's one part of the frame. And I also think that within academia, within people, just scholars working in museums and so on, I think there's just through the way the world is now, a much broader sense of globalised conversation. And I think that frame has enabled something like this to happen. I don't think it could have happened in my youth, to be honest. I think one would have been roundly condemned. I well remember a conference in Cambridge where somebody tried to talk about in a classical conference on an ancient novel, and somebody tried to talk about the Babylonian novel quotes, and everybody laughed. They just didn't take it seriously. I don't think that would be true now. That's a sign of a change, a cultural change, which is a good thing.
Two questions. One is, to what degree, in your judgment, does your focus on image create a narrative that could not otherwise be created of the ancient interaction? That's to say, you spoke in certain terms of correctives, and I'm curious about how far you're willing to go with the intrinsic contribution the image makes to that. Second question is, I would say probably the most overused and therefore meaningless word in the study of religion is syncretism. And I'm wondering if you see ways that the way the project is going can help the field to refine the reflexive comment that religion is cosmopolitan and assimilative and all of that.
Yes, well, you remind me of the first one, and I'll take the second.
Sorry about that.
I'm in agreement with you. I think syncretism, maybe it is a valid case specifically defined about a particular object or group of things. The moment it becomes generalized explanation of nothing, it's useful. But it's very easy to reflex that way, obviously. And we are distinctively trying not to go in that direction. But the thing is, what happens is that the iconographies develop, and they develop in the knowledge of other iconographies, and they borrow from those iconographies. So any kind of influence or borrowing is syncretism, if you like. and then they do something distinctively different. So, while I wouldn't make the claim that these two have borrowed from each other, there is some kind of conceptual difference that is quite distinctive in having the god do the killing versus having the god being the sacrifice. Actually, the sacrificed animal in the sense that Jesus is often represented as a lamb. So something, now there's some kind of thinking that's on parallel lines. Whether you could say they're actually influencing each other, I don't think it doesn't need that. But within a frame in which somehow deity is conceived with a sacrificial context in mind, both of these are rather radical gestures. Since what really should happen is, if you believe Durkheim and his friends, that sacrifice is conducted by people to gods. The god doesn't get involved. So that's something different. And it is about, that's not really an answer to synchrony, but I think we just have to think in terms of structural differentiation, I'd say. Now, what was the first question?
Oh, I just want to know if you're willing to say anything about the degree to which the focus on images allows you to tell a narrative that couldn't otherwise be told.
Yeah.
How far does the evidence take us in a direction that isn't available to classic textual, say, just to pick a random something?
To be honest, I don't know the answer. That is to say, I think we have to play the game. But I'll give you one example. If you do a very broad sweep kind of picture, you could say that what is absolutely typical of the archaeological culture of the Middle East, the Greco-Roman world, you spread it, in antiquity, is the figurine. Just wander around the Oriental Sea. The figurine. Now, and there's a whole archaeology and an anthropology that's obsessed about figurine and what the figurines are. The interesting fact, although it's hardly in this account, is that once you take those very same places and you put them under the broad orbit of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, there's much imagery. It's nonsense to say there's no imagery, but there are no figurines. That's a slight exaggeration, but the outliers are very, very small. And I've been chasing outliers for ages. Every time I find one, now, that seems to me, if the data is true, that is to say, if archaeologists haven't simply misstated everything because they put all the figurines early, and then there is some element of that. But broadly speaking, I think that data is saying something about a kind of, if you think of imagery as a free checkbook or a free bank card that can spend and spend, a check has been put on that bank card with the rise of religions, let's call them Abrahamic or whatever, that have a problem with idolatry. Now that seems to be interesting. Whether that is a datum bigger for religion, that is bigger than just about imagery, but bigger for the understanding of those religions, again, I wouldn't yet go that far. But I think there is something going on there. If we can create models of thinking that have that kind of breadth.
I have a question about the kinds of structures that you're looking at. So you have images, you have coins. Are you looking at architecture at all?
The thing about architecture is it's very difficult because apart from, for example, we have very, very little early Christian architecture that we have any written. Anything that's still in use is useless because it's fiddled around with. Now, I was just passing through the new seminary, or whatever it was, that was once the seminary co-op. I don't know how much of any of those bricks or stone was actually in that building when it was a seminary co-op. It looks kind of vaguely the same with touching up. But it is radically. But the health is different. So that's a problem with building students. And so architecture is particularly difficult because we're dealing largely with non-archaeological material. Archaeological material, but not dug up at freely, as it were. The one case is Buddhism, for example, in all those places where Buddhism was abandoned, but there the archaeology is so bad that we can't reconstruct a single stupa from the stuff we've got. So, in principle, the answer is yes. But I'm hedging my bets with pragmatics, though. I mean, it's a problem.
Question about museums, and in particular the museum dimension of this project and what it hopes to bring to the public. What is the relationship between the images that you'll have, the objects you'll have and be on display, and the sorts of discursive analytic work that go into that, and the sorts of descriptions attached to these images? I'm not even saying something as simple as, well, what's lost in translation, or are the descriptions necessary to really make sense of these, but more about the relationship between those two and what the space of the museum offers to keeping those together as a single whole.
Yeah, you asked a very charged question, because the thing is, there's only so much you can do in an exhibition. I'm at war with my team, because they want to be awfully academic. That is to say, they want to make an argument out of an exhibition. I figure you choose the best objects. What you want is for people to be inspired, interested, moved. Then they can do the work. But an exhibition, I don't think an exhibition can do the work. I think so. So when you say, how much of an argument will it be? I think it just has to show the picture with the wonderful things, contrast them, and then people can get the book or whatever. But I'm sceptical myself as to an exhibition is a different kind of thing from an academic argument. And of course there's a debate about this, but so I just state my own position. But on the other hand, what the museum can do is really open the question. Questions are good. You just, the general public is a very, very broad thing. Many of them, they would never have even heard of this house. Quite a lot of them may actually not. I mean, I had a terrible. Once when I taught in the Courtauld Institute, it was my glorious moment. And we were interviewed from the graduates, and one would show an image, and I showed a very famous and wonderful Caravaggio of the Virgin and Child, and we had half an hour of yes, mother and child, and yes, she looks at it, and the candidate, who was of some kind of Western origin, never got to the Virgin and Child. So when you're dealing, I mean, this is the distal, you're all shocked, but in the world out there, more in Europe maybe than in the world out there, even something so being obvious as what's on the right may not be obvious to a significant group of your public. And you've got to welcome the public. So, before you make arguments, they've got to have some sense of what these things are. I think that's the real world.
But if I may, I guess what I'm suggesting is that even if there isn't an academic argument in this sense, there's still a rhetoric of how the things are presented to a public that is implied and constructed, and some are in and some are out. And there's a poetics of how the objects and the descriptions and the space and the light all fit together.
Yeah. We'll be as sensitive and creative as we can within, of course, the key limitations, which is cost, and particularly what you might call orchestration space. That is, you can't have places where people stop when they need to be moving on. So there's all that kind of, with the museums are obsessive, then you can see why. So there are lots of constraints, incredible amounts of constraints. But within those, we will try and be as creative as possible, we'll try and make some juxtapositions and so on. Yeah.
So forgive me for the question I'm about to ask. But you put scare quotes around culture, but not, I think, around religion.
I should have.
And so it's an obvious question about the degree to which the category of religion itself is either begged in the analysis or, and you and I have had many conversations about this. What I thought I heard was an argument that by tying religion to state sponsorship, you're actually using religion in a very specific sense that historically must be located vis-a-vis certain types of imperial power. And hence it's a heuristic category for the purposes of studying the relationship between religion and political entities. But then you also have to define what an empire is. If that's your engine, then how does the succession of definitions work? And then the third question as well is then maybe back to Allison's question that does that mean more of an emphasis on certain kinds of objects, which therefore reflect the ideology of empire more than, like coins, for example, or even monumental work, rather than smaller things that are everyday objects of persons who happen to find themselves in empires but aren't themselves shapers of ideological frames.
Yeah. Now, yes, I'm myself not a very close friend of the tie religion to empire model. However, when the British Museum originally wanted to make this project, that was their model. And they self-confessed to be a bunch of Marxists. Now, but there is a difference, because if you think of the borderlands idea, it's really an idea about the generation of multiple religions, some of which then emerge into. Islam goes fast to becoming a kind of hegemonic force. Christianity takes quite a long time. Judaism is never a hegemonic force, but it nevertheless has a kind of interesting life of its own. Buddhism is taken up by a state, but that state also takes up Hinduism and Jainism, and none of them really isn't quite that way at that point. But there is state sponsorship, but you couldn't say they're state religions. Whereas Zoroastrianism is in a certain sense a state religion, although that's a real problem because the historical account and the Parsi account are so extreme differences that that's a really difficult one to kind of work through. And then the production of, well, particularly once you have, as it were, state-sponsored exegesis and so on. So it really, I would say, it's about a process of movement between something that really is absolutely not state and something that gets taken up by states. Where I have succumbed to the end is that it is clearly the case that you cannot exclude a state element. That's not really a full answer to you, but in a sense we're in a process of trying to evolve how we would think category.
I'm sorry, I'm probably talking too much, so please quiet down if you wish. But there's another issue, it seems to me, and it covers a huge line, and that is what I call layering. Oh, we're now all Christian. However, you look especially at stories they tell and of things, especially with the lower classes, just what are they? Layering. And that also can float over from other places where you impose a system and then it's not really there.
Yeah. One of the great advantages of iconography is you don't have to worry about that as much. You've just got the stuff, and it makes its point, and you can make your relation to it according to your place in the layer. But of course, the layer point is absolutely right. It's right. Surely the extent of the survival of paganism in a Christian world has been underrated on the level of layering. And clearly, when Christians start fighting, one reason that Islam is so successful is that all the, what used to be called Monophysites, but are now the Aphysites and probably some another name, are much happier to be under Islam than they are under some bullying without an emperor. So the layering is absolutely fundamental. And it's not just about class, but it's about all kinds of language and all kinds of elements. And I couldn't agree more. So I think, and we have to be sensitive to that. But at the same time, maybe the project is just too big to do. In the sense that if you did take on board all the elements, listen, you can't even do what I do. You can't even do early Christian art properly. If properly meant, one had to command not only Greek and Latin, but also Armenian, Georgian, Syriac, Coptic. I instantly self-confess not to be a good hazard, and that's a real. So that raises that problem. But those specific distinctions are, of course, central to your layer question. Yeah.
That's why you need a team.
That's why you need a team. Thank you very much.
Professor Elsner asked me to remind him he needs to teach at 1:30.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.